Okay. Okay, so everyone's admitted in the room now. Okay, welcome everyone to the summary session, the first summary session of the first day of the Evidence for Action Symposium. We've had a really exciting day, very rich discussions and really amazing speeches from prominent speakers. And so it's time to wrap up. I'm sure most of you have joined us today, so you must be aware about the housekeeping rules. I'm just going to share screen for that. So we're going to have a round of chairs giving brief reflections, and please enter your questions in the chat box, and the chair of the session will pose it to the chairs and panelists in this case. So without further delay, if Sam, it's your turn.
Hello, everybody. I'm Sam Waugh. I'm a Sustainability Manager here at the University of Sussex. As Carlos has said, welcome to this afternoon's summary session. It's going to take the format of 6 brief 3-minute feedbacks from the chairs of each plenary session. And then we'll be opening the floor up. We'll be opening the floor up for questions, which you can put in the chat bar, and I'll direct them to the panelists. So kicking off with the first 3-minute feedback, we have Professor Mohammed Shamsuda, sorry. It feels like a bit of a tongue twister. Sam Shuduha from the Institute of Risk and Disaster Reduction at UCL and the School of Global Studies here at the University of Sussex.
Okay, thank you very much, Sam. Just call me Shams. People call me Shams for short. No problem. So yes, well, today it happens to be the Muslim festival of Eid. So I would like to really take the opportunity to wish you all a very happy Eid Mubarak. And in the morning today, I chaired a session. We had 4 presentations, and I'm not supposed to summarize the session. The session was on local adaptation planning and risk, where we had discussions on experiences learned in Indonesia, Bangladesh, and Austria. I'm going to briefly reflect my personal reflection on the session, and I would like to share with you 2 points of reflection. One is on local adaptation, why this is important, and the other one is working together. So also referring to breaking the silos. So on the first point, adaptation should be led and planned locally. That's what we learned in the session. That's because as climate change is intensifying, extreme weather events across the world, no one is really safe, regardless the status of our wealth or the geopolitical divide. Either we live in the global south or the global north, everyone is going to face the negative or the adverse impacts of climate change, and also global change in broader sense. So we must adapt to these global changes, and the adaptation should be very much planned locally and community-based, and it should be inclusive. And the other point about working together, breaking the silos, which is not a new point. I think many of us discussed this topic for a long time, but it keeps coming back. And that's what we learned this morning, that it keeps coming back through our research and policy recommendations. So I'm going to quote from one of the speakers this morning, that is, we need to bring together goals in adaptation, disaster risk reduction, sustainable development, as well as humanitarian agenda. So everything bringing together, because ultimately, if we look through each of these various agenda, the ultimate goal is the same, is to make this world a better place. So we need to draw on each other's strength and basically overcoming our limitations by working together. So these are the two brief reflection points I can draw from this morning session on local adaptation planning and risk. So over to you, Sam. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Mohammed. So moving on to reflections from the second session, which was reframing climate and environmental justice. And we're going to be hearing from Dr. Lars Otto Nace on this one. So it'd be really great to hear from you, Lars.
Yeah, thank you, Sam, and thanks everyone. We had an interesting, very interesting session. It was co-chaired by myself and Amber Huff, also at IDS. And it was called Reframing Climate and Environmental Justice. And what we had 5 presentations that all sort of covered hidden, in inverted commas, aspects of climate and environmental justice, issues regarding justice that often hides in mainstream policy discourses and narratives, and that we think, we argue that it's still important to bring out. So I think I'll just run through a few points as reflections, and again, this is not summary, so it's more reflection and some points that came up in the discussions. First one, a big issue is the importance of a place-based understanding and understanding of the historical process that have created and are perpetuating processes of injustice, either procedural injustices or distributive injustices, and the importance of understanding those in any interventions or any kind of action on whether it's climate or SDGs that can sort of inadvertently reinforce injustice. Another big point, I think, was around the politics of evidence and the power of narratives. And we saw this, that, data is rarely neutral in an absolute sense. It's always serves somebody's purpose and somebody's interests. And not sort of highlighting that can lead to kind of narratives around we need to do this, and there's a tension then between sort of the need for simplistic and clear, simple and clear messages, and the kind of damage that can cause, and the lack of nuance in those messages that can cause to lives and livelihoods. And I think that came up, for example, in the discussion over livestock, and the livestock as villains in the climate debates, but there are a lot of nuances, both in terms of emissions from livestock systems and the importance they have for livelihoods. A third point was around the importance of asking critical questions and always sort of questioning who's benefiting, whose interests are served by particular narratives, particular data, and policy discourses. And of course, always speak truth to power, tackling the political elite and the incumbent power, for example, but amidst concerns over shrinking space for critical research, critical reflections, critical questions among governments and funders post-COVID in particular. And the last point, because inevitably these sessions bring up a lot of problems, but it was also stressed that there are opportunities for action and change that do exist, and change can happen quickly and when the time and opportunity exist. And we've seen these over recent years around green changes in green transformations, for example, lifestyle changes, and we need to kind of reiterate that these opportunities exist and kind of resist, in many cases, we need to resist the sort of emergency extreme framings, because they often create extreme responses, either in terms of draconic measures that put people more at risk and exclude marginalized people even more than already, or they can create a kind of apathy that is not also very helpful in many cases. So I'll stop there. It's just a few reflections from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, Lars, for those reflections on reframing climate and environmental justice. So we're now going to move on to reflections from Maya Boggers from the Copernicus Institute of Sustainable Development at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. And the session in question is around the steering effects of global goals, fostering system-level transformation to address climate change and other sustainable development challenges.
Thank you, Sam. Yeah, so our session was on mostly 4 studies on the SDGs and whether they can steer these system-level transformations that we're looking for. Like, is this the holy grail, these goals? So some of the common themes in the presentations were the notion of integrated sustainability. So trying to find out, how do we increase policy coherence? Are the SDGs indeed a good tool to look at this sort of 360 that was mentioned this morning, to look at all the different fields and how they relate to each other? And some other commonalities in the presentations were quantitative research, quite a bit of text analysis, and looking at the international and national level. And so I guess the key takeaway is that they can be a tool to look at integrated sustainability, but in practice, this seems really actually quite far away and quite hard to achieve. Even though this sort of policy coherence in the ultimate sense where all the SDGs align would be great, we're really not there yet. One of the things we discussed is the study of interlinkages, like how the different targets relate to each other. And this can be very context dependent, so differ a lot locally. And there's also different methods and they give different results. So there's a lot of work to be done there to figure that out. We also discussed the possibility of using text as data. As I said, there was quite a few text analysis studies. And of course, there's huge amounts of data getting more and more available. So a lot of text documents, website text, project descriptions, and academic publications too. And with these new sort of methods, we can try and derive insights from that, but there's also a lot of challenges still there. So we did see this as a future research avenue to really dive into those new digital methods and see what they can bring to our field. And lastly, what we discussed is also to stay critical, also of the SDGs themselves. Like, are they really fostering this transformation? Because from what it seems from most of our studies, the effects are quite limited. If they are even there, it's really hard to discern the effects. And there might even be some negative effects where it seems a lot is happening, but actually a lot of organizations or states are cherry picking and they are not working on the SDGs as an integrated vision. So those were some of our key takeaways.
Thank you, Maya. So moving on to the sessions from this afternoon. Next up, we have Ebony Holland from the International Institute for Environment and Development, who's going to give her reflections on the session that was held this afternoon on locally led implementation of climate adaptation and the SDGs.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sam. I hope you can all hear me okay. I've just had a dog who's completely come alive and is barking and doing all sorts of things. So I'm so sorry if you can hear that in the background. But yes, as Sam said, we just literally finished co-chairing the session this afternoon under Stream A. I co-chaired it with Professor Mizan Khan from the International Centre for Climate Change and Development in Bangladesh, and some of you may be familiar with that organisation. Our session really looked at the importance of locally led adaptation and how impact research is helping to drive more locally led approaches. So very similar to what Mohammed was talking about in the first summary. We had presentations from both the researcher and the practitioner perspective, because we wanted to kind of get both sides of the coin, I suppose. And a couple of things that really stuck out to me was some research which showed just how little climate finance actually does get down to the local level. And I think we all kind of know this, but it's kind of still quite stark to hear it. For example, the research that was shown suggested that looking at the nationally determined contributions of least developed countries under the Paris Agreement, within that, least developed countries have determined as a whole that there's around $200 billion that they need to meet their adaptation needs. But actually at the moment, there's only about 5.9 billion going towards that we can track through the different reporting mechanisms. So there's a really huge disparity there. And if that trend continues, that would be approximately 3% of annual adaptation finance needs that LDCs need up to 2030. So some really kind of stark figures there that are just kind of, I'm mulling over at the moment because it's quite horrendous. We also had a fantastic presentation on some research that came out earlier this year, which looked at the extent to which adaptation projects do or don't address kind of underlying vulnerability. And that was a really interesting presentation because I think it opened up a lot of people's minds as to the extent to which adaptation can actually address vulnerability. There was some really good points made about how in some cases this research showed that it actually reinforced vulnerability or distributed it to different people or to different communities around the kind of target audience. And that there were sort of some interesting ways to overcome this. For example, not applying a cookie cutter kind of blueprint approach to adaptation. It needs to be highly contextualized, of course, and really embedding knowledge and learning processes in the heart of these adaptation projects as well, so that it's not, as I said, just a kind of cookie cutter approach to everything. From the practitioner side, we had really robust discussion about what practitioners need from researchers to kind of drive locally led approaches. And what struck me from that particular discussion was the need for practitioners to really maintain flexibility in their adaptation programming and to build in this action learning into the process itself, because without that, the program can't be adaptable in itself. And so it's very difficult for it to drive adaptation itself. And so, yeah, there's some good discussions there around how these big kind of multinational institutes like the World Bank and others can kind of embed more of that flexibility. And I think I'll leave it there. Thanks, Sam.
Thanks, Ebony. So on to our penultimate panelist here, which is Dr. Mary Menton, from here at the University of Sussex, who's going to share her reflections on advancing climate change adaptation, sustainable development, and the rights of marginalised people.
Great, thank you. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, so we had a really interesting panel conversations that I think spoke quite a lot to what Shams has just said about the importance of locally led initiatives and also about breaking the silos. But also leading on to also discussing a little bit about the international law angle and what that can bring to the table. So one of our speakers, Lisa Hiwasaki, spoke about her study of the different frameworks out there, the disaster risk reduction, the SDGs and the UN climate change frameworks, that they don't speak to each other enough and they're not integrated enough. And then what you end up then seeing is the implications are the worst for equality and marginalized peoples. So I think that really responds again back into this question of how do we make sure that we're actually talking to each other and integrating our approaches on the ground. So Heli Das spoke about an initiative in India, and specifically, I think the thing that came out from her presentation for me was the importance of locally led responses and ground up grassroots adaptation, that those were actually the most effective and the most likely to succeed, but also that the self-help groups are something that we can think about supporting, these grassroots movements, that there might be ways that we can support them in getting information flowing amongst the group better. And then Natalie Jones spoke about customary international law and how that has brought a lot of progress in terms of integrating Indigenous peoples' participation into international decision-making. And then the question then is, well, can international customary law push the envelope a bit more for things like equality and integration across these frameworks? Can we get enough countries on board to push push the envelope further in terms of focusing on equality. Although there is a bit of skepticism about the slow rate at which those sort of legal mechanisms can work. So that I think goes back then again to these locally led, ground-based initiatives that really have a lot of promise and a lot of potential for actually helping ensure adaptation at the local level. I think that's the main things that came out. Yeah, I think I'll stop there. I could go on, but I think that was really the essence, that we really need to be talking to each other and integrating and making sure we all know what we're actually speaking about. What is equality? What is vulnerability? What is resilience? What are we pushing? What are we working towards? And that there's a lack of integration currently that we need to remedy. Thanks.
Thank you, Mary. So last but not least, we have Dr. Francisco Estrada Porrua from the Climate Change Research Program at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, who is going to give his reflections on cities as catalysts for sustainable transformation.
Thank you, Sam. Well, we had a very interesting session. We have two presenters talking about case studies, about how communities can engage to bring transformative actions. One of the case studies was in Europe, in France and in the UK, about solar energy, how communities are organizing to promote solar energy. And the other one was in Brazil, and it was about community agriculture, and how this is tackling several problems at the same time. For example, with what they are producing, they are feeding people that don't have access to food, and also they are selling part of what they produce to get some money, and then they donate this for the communities. It's interesting because one of the discussions was centered about how big central investment is. Okay, it's really needed, but we have to complement this with more localized and local communities actions. And this, we also discussed that somehow in developing countries, we have a lot of investment going for mitigation, but adaptation is somewhat forgotten. And that we have to kind of change this. It's because, for example, most of growth in cities is going to happen in developing countries in this century. So also we talked about barriers, about this, what is stopping these efforts. And the biggest barrier seems to be legal, that we don't have like enough laws or things that really give investment opportunities a chance to really set in. And also the lack of data. Publicly available data, that's really important, and it's really missing. And I think I will leave it there, but yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Francisco. So it sounds like lots of great discussions with both sort of individual nuance and a lot of commonality and themes emerging from the different sessions. So handing things over to the floor, we've got a couple of questions from Joe, actually. I'm just wondering if we want to take those first, and then please, everybody, do post your chats, stating if it's for all panelists or for a specific panelist in the chat box, and I will get to you in order. So the first question was to Shams from Joe, and that was, if climate adaptation should be led locally, does that also mean that resources and funds for adaptation should be raised locally? And if not, what are the alternatives and how shall this work?
Thank you, Sam, and thank you, Joe, for your wonderful question. Very difficult one. I suppose we talked a lot about planning being locally co-produced with local communities, but we haven't really talked very much about who is going to fund different adaptation measures that often come from nationally from the government, and also above the national level, you have the international donors. Especially, I'm talking in the context of developing countries in the global south that are not particularly wealthy, or they don't necessarily have the funding to develop all kinds of local adaptation measures. So we, in countries like Bangladesh, where I'm originally from, we always depend on World Bank or ADB or other donors to loan, provide money to do certain adaptation or mitigation measures, and often what we discuss normally is that those big chunk of loans or fundings are often attached to string, right? I mean, string attached. So basically, you have to follow a certain agenda, and by the time you actually go to the local level, there is probably very little money left to do that. So my short answer to Joe's question would be no. I don't think the resource or the money should be sourced locally. It should come from the government. But I'm going to make a quick analogy with our world-beating track and trace system in the UK for COVID-19. We all know how throughout the pandemic how this groundbreaking or world-beating system really failed, and that's because it was done from top to bottom nationally. And we heard from local authorities over and over again that they should take the charge. They should really be consulted with in order to really control the pandemic. So I think the local knowledge is very important, but the resource and the funding actually should come from nationally. That would be my answer.
Thank you, Mohammed. Ebony, I see you've got your hand up. Is it in direct response to what Mohammed's saying? Would you like to come in?
Yeah, I'm just reflecting on how sad I am to have missed your session, Mohammed, because I think there's a lot of crossovers in between our sessions. I might try and watch it back. But just I thought I'd also just quickly jump in on your question, Joe. And certainly a lot of the things that came up in our session was around the kind of international climate finance. So speaking specifically about kind of climate finance, how a lot of the money at the international level just really doesn't reach the local level at all, despite lots of, increasing kind of pledges to do so. And there's a number of reasons for that, and there's quite a bit of kind of research that we can direct you towards, but often it's highly intermediated. So once, for example, the Green Climate Fund releases money, it sort of gets locked up in these big international intermediaries, so it doesn't often have the opportunity to get to the local level. It's also very difficult for local communities to get direct access to the money because of a whole swathe of sort of accreditation processes and hoops that they need to jump through. And kind of at the other end, because of the nature and how a lot of the climate finance is reported on, it's also very difficult for local communities to see where some of the climate finance is going. And so it's a kind of messy systemic issue. But I think there's some movements in the right direction around untangling a lot of that, so that there is a bit more of this money going down to that local level, as Mohammed says, from that international and to an extent the national level as well.
Great, thank you, Ebony. So on to Joe's second question, which was a question to Maya. If the SDGs are not fulfilling their potential to integrate various sustainability approaches, what should be done so that they do fulfill this potential? And I wonder if this is a question that maybe some of the other panelists might want to come in on after Maya as well, because it is kind of the exam question for the session, really, isn't it?
Yes, it is definitely a big question. Good question, though. I think if I were to make one change going forward with the SDGs and the Agenda 2030, or actually two changes, one would be, as I mentioned, there's several studies into these interlinkages between the targets. And I think it would be vital for every country, and perhaps even at the subnational level, if you're a big country, to look at how these targets actually relate. And for example, in the Netherlands, where I live and do my PhD, this hasn't been done at all. Like, we're 6 years in, and they haven't even looked specifically at how all the targets relate in this country, let alone in our foreign policy. And I think we should be able to do this. We have the resources and the knowledge and skills. So I think this would be a first step. And then once you have those insights, you can actually see, okay, how is policy going to affect the different targets, and where is there going to be synergies, and where is there going to be trade-offs, and do we want those trade-offs? So I think that would be a great first step. And the second one might actually be in the presentation, because in the end, there are 17 goals, and for the ones that are very familiar with the SDGs, they know that they're supposed to be interrelated. But I was talking to my friend the other day, and he works at a company, and I mentioned cherry picking, and he's like, are we not supposed to pick the SDGs that we work on? And he completely didn't get it, even though he works for a company that actually very sustainably and ethically tries to produce their products. So part of it is also in the presentation, maybe. So if there could be a sort of network presentation or something better than the 17 separate squares, maybe that will help in the awareness creation.
Thank you, Maya. Food for thought there. And Francisco, would you like to come in on this point?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to share, for example, here in Mexico, when we talk about SDGs regarding climate change, most of the discussion happens about mitigation and how close are we to fulfilling these goals is related to mitigation. When we clearly have a big problem with vulnerability and like a deficit of adaptation, we're not even adapted to current climate. So I think that would be really useful. I don't know how this happens in other countries, but here it should be very useful to what Maya was saying, no? How to really see how can I say this, like the roots of the different SDGs reaching other SDGs. And for example, it's kind of weird that we don't talk about climate risks, no? How we are reducing these risks is more about mitigation. I don't know if somebody else can comment on this, if in their countries things are different, but here it's definitely like that. Huh?
So did anybody else want to either come back on Francisco's question there around their country's experience, or also just add any final thoughts to Joe's question around what could be done to basically integrate various sustainability approaches in the SDGs? Mary.
I wasn't sure how to raise my hand. Yeah, I just, this gets me thinking a little bit about, I think the bottlenecks against integration are very similar at the national and at the international levels, in a way that we have, you have these mandates from these international, the SDGs, Paris, etc., and they go to individual ministries who then will fight for territory over who gets to control which project and who gets the budget, and this is your remit, this is my remit. And so even if everything was perfect at this international integrated level, when it comes down to the national level, are the systems in place to actually have an approach that talks across the silos and across the institutions? And so I think it's a lot of work needs to be done at breaking down those barriers, both nationally and internationally, and recognizing that they are very, very much embedded in the way the systems currently work. And I would think, high in the sky perhaps, but that at the international level at least, we could have people or projects or programs whose responsibility is to build those links, because that doesn't seem to be, yes, maybe the SDGs were supposed to do that, but that's not what's actually happening. So I think that maybe it is about pushing for really making sure that there is a body or a program or an institution that does some of that work, but recognizing that solving it at the international level is not going to be enough on the ground.
Okay, thank you. Unless anybody else wants to come in, we've got 10 minutes left. So Khadija asked quite a similar question around integrating different agendas. So and asked if there was a crisis of multilateralism. I'm thinking people probably think the answer is yes, but I'm just wondering if we want to move on to the next question, which was from Iris Saldiva. And I think because we've got about 9 minutes left, if anybody else is desperately wants to ask a question, please do post it now. We can come to you, probably time for one more after Iris. So Iris's question is, everybody, how do you see the role of data science in addressing solutions for sustainable development? How academia should lead the path to create more social scientists, specifically because many researchers got trouble getting information in some areas, like in adaptation, for example. So I think this is a question about how do you see the role of data science in addressing sustainable development solutions? Would anybody like to come in on that?
I can make a quick response to that, as I'm very interested in data science. But of course, I come from a very strong physical science background, but I do work with social scientists a lot. For instance, I have been working with John Thompson for a number of years on few projects in Africa. And yes, I think the response to this question is that we do need to use the wealth of data that is out there, especially in this era of data science and big data, especially geospatial big data, as well as social media generated big data. All data should be considered when we assess situations, especially in areas or in certain parts of the world where there is no real monitoring infrastructure for either physical or social science data gathering practices. So as academics, we have the role to train people in data science, not only in physical science but also in social science, and I think especially got information. Okay, well, I'm not going to get into a specific area such as adaptation. I thought I would my response would focus more on the sort of generic response and basically highlighting the need of data scientists, not in physical science but also in social science.
Thank you. So basically we have time, I think, for one more question, which is specifically directed from John Thompson to Lars Otto. And then I would like to give each of the panelists one more minute to just say if there's anything they'd like to add following the final discussion. Obviously, it's up to you whether you want to come back in or not. So the last question of the evening, like I've said, is to Lars from John Thompson. And it's about the power of narratives for shaping discourses and influencing policy. Ultimately, John would like to know, how can we reframe these narratives in a way that's more nuanced, more empowering, and ultimately more transformative while not making them too complex? Would more emphasis on success stories and innovations help? And if so, who defines success?
A very good question, John. If I had the answer to that, I think
we started the conversation in the parallel session,
yes.
But we didn't get so far.
I think the basic point is that I think a lot of these global narratives are for a global audience, and they're often there for a reason. You want to highlight the plight of local people in the face of climate stresses, for example. But the problem with them is that if they're not nuanced, and if this complexity isn't coming through in any sort of way, they can be directly disempowering to the people on the ground. And I think there are good examples, for example, on indigenous knowledge, on gender, for example, where the global narratives is around look at the effects of local people in local communities. Look at the impacts on women, for example, and which then leads to the idea that local people are basically have no capacity, no knowledge, or women are weak and vulnerable, which are very unhelpful actually when it comes to action. So and can be directly disempowering, and I think the discussion has moved on from there the last few years. I think just bringing out stories, as you say, about the capacity and knowledge that exists at that level, which then gives the agency, gives the kind of empowers those who should be empowered in this, bring out those voices. And this is about, distributive justice at the end of the day. It's about who benefits and who loses from climate finance, that was discussed earlier, for example, to make sure that the people who are actually should benefit are benefiting from this. But it's as much about recognizing their knowledge. So it's a recognitional justice in this. And there's also procedural justice issues, or bring them in a meaningful way. So we talked a little bit about in the session before about the importance of networks and the importance of building on networks that already exist or can be supported between local people, local organizations that work with people, people in government and position of power, because you need them to make the change that understands this or are in a position of change. And you kind of need to find your alliances in this. So I'm afraid I don't think there's an easy answer to this question, and I wish I had an easier answer, but it's very context specific. But I think these alliances, champions, which are not new issues, but I think we need to build on those initiatives and actions that are already existing. Thank you.
Thank you, Lars. So I'm just about to wrap up, but before I do, has any of the panelists got any very final insights that they're desperate to get out? No? Okay. In that case, then thank you so much, everybody. Thank you in particular to our panelists, Shams, Lars, Maya, Ebony, Mary, and Francisco, for their very insightful reflections. I'm not going to try and wrap up what was said, because Joe will be doing that at the end of the conference. But obviously, we hope you'll join us tomorrow. We'll be starting again at 9 a.m. on Zoom with John Thompson chairing the next session, and we'll continue with the themes that we established today around climate adaptations and the SDGs, climate and environmental justice, and sustainable transformations in the green recovery. So I hope everybody has a nice evening, and see you tomorrow. Bye.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carlos.
Bye.